She was 57 years old, standing in a parking lot in Phoenix, Arizona, clutching a cardboard box filled with 23 years of her life. Inside that box were a few picture frames, a coffee mug that said World's Best Sales Associate, and a wilting plant she'd kept on her desk since 1987. The security guard had walked her out like she was a criminal. 23 years of perfect attendance, 23 years of arriving early and staying late, 23 years of giving everything she had to a company that just looked her in the eyes and told her she was no longer needed. Her name was Margaret Chen, and on that sweltering August afternoon in 2010, she had exactly $214 in her bank account. Not $200,000. Not $20,000. $214. The kind of money that doesn't even cover a week of groceries and gas. She sat in her 13-year-old Honda Civic, the air conditioning barely working, and she did something she hadn't done since her mother's funeral 15 years earlier. She cried. Not the quiet, dignified tears you might expect from a woman who had survived so much already. No. These were the ugly, gasping sobs of someone who had just watched everything they'd worked for disappear in a single afternoon meeting. But here's what you need to understand about Margaret Chen. This wasn't the first time life had knocked her down. Not even close. Margaret was born in 1953 in a small fishing village outside of Taipei, Taiwan. Her father died when she was 4 years old, drowned in a storm while trying to bring in the day's catch. Her mother, a woman who couldn't read or write, raised Margaret and her 3 siblings by washing clothes for wealthier families in the village. They lived in a 2-room shack with a dirt floor. Margaret's first pair of shoes came when she was 8 years old. Hand-me-downs from a girl in the next village whose feet had grown too big. When Margaret was 17, her mother scraped together every penny the family had ever saved and bought her a one-way ticket to America. "You go," her mother said in Taiwanese, pressing the ticket into Margaret's hands. "You make something. You make something for all of us." Margaret landed in Los Angeles in 1970 with $40 sewn into the lining of her coat and exactly 12 words of English. She didn't know a single person in the entire country. She was 17 years old, alone, terrified, and determined. For the first 3 months, she slept on the floor of a restaurant kitchen in Chinatown, working 18-hour days washing dishes and chopping vegetables. She learned English by watching television through the window of an electronics store on her 1 day off each month. She would stand there for hours, reading lips, mimicking sounds, writing down words she didn't understand on scraps of paper she'd fish out of the garbage. By 1975, she had saved enough money to move to Phoenix, where a distant cousin had told her there were opportunities in retail. She got a job at a department store called Davidson's, starting in the stockroom, hauling boxes that weighed almost as much as she did. The managers noticed something about Margaret right away. She was relentless. While other employees complained about the Arizona heat, Margaret just worked harder. While others took their full breaks, Margaret studied the merchandise, learning everything she could about fabrics, cuts, and what made customers reach for their wallets. Within 2 years, she was on the sales floor. Within 5, she was the top salesperson in the women's clothing department. By 1987, she was a department manager, and by 1995, she was the regional sales director for the entire Southwest Division. Margaret sent money home to Taiwan every single month for 35 years. She put her younger brother through medical school. She bought her mother a real house with a real floor. She never missed a payment, never complained, never asked for anything in return. And then, on August 14, 2010, a 29-year-old executive from corporate headquarters sat across from her in a conference room and said the words that changed everything. "We're restructuring. Your position has been eliminated." Just like that, 23 years erased in 11 words. But what that young executive didn't know, what nobody in that room could have possibly understood, was that he hadn't just fired an aging employee who was past her prime. He had just unleashed something the fashion industry had never seen before. Margaret sat in that parking lot for 45 minutes. She watched the other employees come and go. She watched the life she had built walk past her window without even glancing in her direction. And somewhere between the tears and the heat and the humiliation, something inside Margaret Chen began to shift. She thought about her mother, That illiterate woman who had sacrificed everything for a chance Margaret almost didn't take. She thought about the dirt floor and the borrowed shoes and the $40 sewn into her coat lining. She thought about every person who had ever underestimated her, every obstacle that was supposed to break her, every moment she was supposed to give up but didn't. And then she thought about something she had noticed during her 3 decades in retail, something that had been bothering her for years. She thought about the women her age who came into the store, women with money to spend and style to spare, women who were ignored by an industry obsessed with youth. She thought about the frustrated sighs, the disappointed faces, the way these women would leave empty-handed because nothing was designed with them in mind. Margaret wiped her eyes. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. 57 years old. $200. No job. No prospects. No safety net. And for the first time in hours, she smiled. Because Margaret Chin had just discovered something that most people never find, no matter how long they search. She had found her purpose. She had found the problem she was born to solve. What she did next would not only change her life forever, but it would revolutionize an entire industry and prove to the world that your age is not your expiration date. She reached into her purse, pulled out a crumpled receipt and a pen that barely worked, and she started writing down an idea that would one day be worth over $2 billion. But first, she would have to survive the hardest 18 months of her entire life, a period so brutal that she would later describe it as walking through fire while the whole world told me to stop. What Margaret didn't know yet was that rock bottom was about to get even lower, and the woman who would become her greatest enemy was already waiting. Part 2. Where we left off, Margaret Ellen Thornton was standing in that parking lot, clutching a cardboard box with 23 years of her life stuffed inside. $200. No pension, no prospects, and a world that had already written her off. But here's what nobody knew. Here's what even Margaret herself didn't fully understand yet. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table in her small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and she did something that would change everything. She started writing. Not a business plan, not a resume. She wrote a letter to herself at 22 years old. The young woman who had dreamed of designing clothes. The young woman who had sketched dresses in the margins of her notebooks during college lectures. The young woman who had put those dreams aside to be practical, to be responsible, to be what everyone expected her to be. And in that letter, she made a promise. She wrote, "I'm sorry I abandoned you. I'm sorry I let fear make my decisions. But I'm still here. And I'm not done yet." The next morning, Margaret did something that shocked everyone who knew her. She took $50 of her remaining $200 and bought fabric from a discount store. Not fancy fabric, clearance fabric, remnants that other designers had rejected. Her daughter called her frantic. "Mom, you need that money for rent. You need that money for food. What are you doing?" And Margaret said something that still gives me chills to this day. She said, "Sweetheart, I've been surviving my whole life. It's time I started living." For the next 3 months, Margaret worked 18-hour days in her apartment. She had one sewing machine, a Singer her mother had given her in 1971. The same machine she'd used to make her children's Halloween costumes. The same machine that had sat in her closet for 15 years, collecting dust while she collected paychecks at a job she hated. She designed 7 pieces. Just 7. A collection she called Unfinished Business. But here's where the first twist comes in, and this is where the story gets interesting. Margaret couldn't afford to rent a booth at any fashion trade show. She couldn't afford a website,